So the show here really seems to be about comparisons, talking about the past and how the past is influencing today, and the kind of work that is being created from our perception of basically the work that had been made, sometimes quite recently and sometimes quite in the past. And my first question isn't so much about why we do this as artists or art appreciators, why we look to the past for the influences that sort of draw us out. But my question to you is, can you sort of briefly give us a little bit of an overview of your relationship to these influences? In your own words, and just really briefly, what do you draw from these folks that you have made comparisons with within this exhibition?
I'll start out by saying, emotionally, I am influenced by a lot of these artists. I'm emotionally, I feel emotionally at one with them as far as their struggles and as far as what they really are trying to do, not necessarily. I would say mine is obviously the most abstract work in the room, and there's a different feeling you have to create that kind of work. And my artists, my mark-making artists, basically have taken that leap to the dark side to do that. And Cy Twombly, in specific, was just never really recognized for the longest time, and he kept making the marks and making the marks and making the marks and making the marks. And all of a sudden, he started to get a little bit of recognition, whether that was what he needed to get or not. At some point, you just trudge on, no matter whether you're getting the recognition or not. And I feel like, you know, right now in my career, I have to like trudge on. And a little bit of it has to do with growing up in this area where there's a really strong realist influence. And you can't help but want to be accepted a little bit and want to be liked. But you also have to do what you have to do. So that, and Cy Twombly, I mean, and Sol LeWitt, very much emotionally. If anybody has ever read the letter he wrote to Ava Hess, they should really read it. Because it's all about, you know, one of his famous quotes is, "Don't worry about being cool, be your own uncool." And he was just always, you know, saying, just do it, and like, just do it. Stop worrying about what people think, or what people are going to say, or if it's going to sell, or if it's green, or if it's blue. Okay, let's stop there. So I have had a couple of local artists come into my studio just because they're curious about my material. And when they start messing around with textures and stuff like that, they're like, wow, this is, you know, really fun. And so I don't know that I've actually influenced them, but hopefully I've given them an opportunity to go, to learn different material, to use different material, and to not be self-conscious about using it.
It makes me think about this idea of courage in painting and sort of the courageousness. When I first walked in, I thought with you, Vicki, that I thought that there was an incredible amount of courage of working in non-representational, or largely non-representational. There are some examples, like the horse, that are well within the sort of representational realm. But you are working very heavily in this sort of this vocabulary of symbols. These this kind of layering of this paint, this sort of fearlessness with the paint, and then this ripping through and creating this sort of symbolic. It's almost sort of an archaeology of painting. How do you feel about this idea? Do you see yourself as a fearless figure, especially in the world of representational painting of the Brandywine tradition?
I feel myself.
This is good stuff, by the way.
I'm like scratching the top of the box. You know, I haven't like burst out of being really fearless yet because it's very scary. So I'm as courageous as I can be right now. But every series of work is much different for me. And I think people can start seeing some similar mark making and this and that, but this is a totally different series than you might have seen last year from my work. And I don't really fight with that too much. I know it's important to have work that people recognize as yours, but that's just not how it comes out for me. And you know, I do that, and then I'm going to take that in a different place. And you know, there might be some more color, but you know, I was thinking, you know, right now, if I want to do all this texture, you got to keep the colors down for me. And really let the texture sing. If I tossed a bunch of color in there, I think it would just be too much for my aesthetics. So the courageousness comes, I think, by how I feel when I'm painting. And I feel a bit, sometimes I feel like a boxer, sometimes I feel like a caged cat. And I will, kind of, view the painting like on the easel or on the wall from, a distance and get over here and mix some paint or, play with this pen. And then I'll like, bam, I'll jump on it. And those moments are almost, I don't know, it's a little insane, I think, insanity or something. So maybe I'm courageous at that point. And I'll stand back and I'll look and I'll see, did I just ruin that composition or did I enhance that composition?
We'll find out tomorrow.
But, like if it happens to be a pen there or a screwdriver, something is saying you've got to dig in. This painting needs this to keep its life and keep it alive. So sometimes I stand back and look at my paintings and I'm like, wow, that's a little strong and almost too energetic. But that's I guess where I am right now. And the energy comes out in the scratching and the mark making and the tapping.
And that performance, the attack, is really half the artwork. And Sarah, when I first walked in, and when we first met just a few moments ago, feels like so long ago. But I said I was so impressed with the fact that you're working with such strong sense of narrative, with a sort of almost surrealism, really, in the sort of subject matter. And at the same time, you're drawing people into this narrative, you're drawing people into this idea of story within your paintings, and at the same time, you're obliterating it. You're creating this composition that allows for a chaos, allows for misunderstanding. And so can you address that a little bit?
Yes, I hope I can attempt it.
If not, we won't.
No, I'll just I mean, speaking of archaeology and Charles Wilson Peele and being and fearlessness and the spirit of adventure and curiosity and all these things it takes to paint, I think those attributes of certain historical figures have been a motivating force in my work and they've become muses to me. So I've just finished a series about that was inspired by the journals of Lewis and Clark, and through that exploration I found that Charles Wilson Peele was actually the recipient of a lot of the specimens that Lewis and Clark collected, and he stuffed them and hung them up at his little museum in Philadelphia. And I followed the story of his unearthing of this mastodon skeleton that's in his self-portrait at the Academy. And I wanted to know what happened to that mastodon skeleton and also kind of the background behind it. So it turns out at the time that skeleton was unearthed, it was very controversial, the idea of, yes, leaving room in a narrative painting for people to imagine what the story is, I think is important. I don't intend for my paintings to be illustrative. They don't divulge specific facts, but they more draw on history and kind of try to channel a certain energy from a story or from a source of inspiration.
So some influences can be immediate past predecessors in contemporary artwork. It can be prehistoric materials. But Stanley, you had a rather sort of unique situation in that you actually got to work with one of your major influences. What was it like working with Arthur da Costa at Kappa?
Arthur probably was kind of the most important relationship with a colleague that I've ever had. One of the reasons I did want to use Arthur as an example of an influence was he's not known like as many of the names that we're using, Goya, even Peele in our area. Worked as an instructor at the Academy and was a working painter throughout his life, and I had the great fortune of meeting him as just a kid right out of high school, and it was the first time I saw a advanced painter painted. Arthur was one of the few people who demonstrated at the Academy. He would just set up and he would just look at it, usually one of the students, and give a demonstration of a palette, maybe a historic palette, an impressionist palette, or 18th century palette, you know, different types. Painting is very technical, and you need somebody of a higher level to kind of begin to introduce you to
and to draw you out.
Yes, to draw you out, and oil painting has a lot of technical challenges, and you know, when I saw the demonstration for the first time, it was like you look like this. I was like, oh my God, you know, it's so you know, there's no mucking about, you know, it's just an experienced painter goes through a series. You know, a painting is finished, you see the final skin, but most paintings in here are done in layers. So you know, there's this progression of layers, and watching a high-level painter proceed through a succession of layers, and the intent is you know, the economy of means, the intent, you know, the intelligence. These things had names too, like passages had names, you know, like who thought, you know, like I just was so blown away, you know, like the first, you know, like the first kind of, you know, saturated bit of chroma on the cheek, you know, that introduction of saturated note, you know, I thought, geez, this is like pure magic. This is like watching Jimi Hendrix. You know? There has been a great revival in representational work, and not everybody mentions Arthur, but if they were at the Academy, you know, somehow they really were influenced by his work. The thing about Arthur, you know, he spent his whole life, like Andrew Wyatt, swimming against the current, you know, and to meet an individual like this, and to notice you're going against the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, you know, and realize that not only is it interesting, but there's potential to do really interesting work. And my generation, you know, has gone on. People like Stuart Chills, Vincent Desiderian, you know, like people have gone on to do exceptional work in this area, and they've started here, you know. And I just feel just a little part of it, you know, just part of this group.
So to sort of wind down this a little bit, I wanted to sort of shift gears just a little bit, and I wanted to talk about this concept of sort of pre-visualization. This is often a sort of term that we associate with photographers, and it was a catch term that we used a lot with a recent exhibition that we did on Ansel Adams at the Beatty Museum, where at one point in an artist's career, they were able to, in his case, look through a camera and know exactly what his finished product was going to be. Truly, that he would not only know what he was shooting, but he knew the filters, he knew the daylight, he knew the kind of process he was going to go through. He knew the steps and what the effects of those steps were going to be on a final product. And I wanted you all, because I feel like we're going to have very different answers to this, I wanted you all to sort of talk about this concept of pre-visualization.
What Paul Revere did, but she rode twice as far in the middle of the night, but nobody knows her name. At least less people know her name than Paul Revere. And originally she was on the horse, whose nose is just out in front of all the soldiers. And speaking of like what you envision in a composition, and then how you have to change the piece just to like make it more technically sound, or like for the sake of the piece, as a visual piece, the decisions you have to make. So I actually wiped out a figure of her, which was hard to do emotionally, but in the end I thought it's also symbolic of where she is in history. Like she has sort of been forgotten in
Adds to the poetry of the piece.
yeah, it actually represents more of her story than if she were there and you could see every freckle and eyelash and the way her hair was braided. Because who knows, right? Like,
You can judge the piece based on the absence.
yeah. So, so that is one element of this painting. And the other is it's pretty directly taken from the Howard Pyle piece of the Revolutionary War, which is hanging at the Brandywine now. And I was looking at his painting and comparing it to a Kata Kollwitz etching, which was done around the same time, which is hanging in a museum in Cologne. And so it's a piece I visit every Wednesday and, and have become a little bit obsessed with. But the underlying geometry in her composition and Howard Pyle's painting is, the similarities are uncanny. So I don't know who saw whose piece, but part of the essay of this painting is recognizing this geometry in both of their works and trying to emulate it. So the paint looks a little bit like splashed on, and I let some incidental drips like navigate down to the bottom, but there are some linear underpaintings of the painting that were really important as kind of a nod or an homage to both the Howard Pyle piece and the Cole's piece. So
you always intended for the horse to be up there, but she was riding it?
yeah, I wanted her and her mare to be soaring over the soldiers, like the horses know, like she is ahead of them all, actually. She, was warning the militia that the British were coming, so I wanted the horse to be far out above the soldiers.
I have a totally developed sense of pre-visualization. I think in the painting process, it's maybe a little more difficult because the painting process, as you're working, different options just kind of pop up for you, right? And they're hard to kind of the start to finish is a little hard to preconceive, engaged in looking, So I still set up in an old-timey way. I actually set up things and I look at them and I respond to them. And so I don't know totally where I'm going. And my starting point is I like to set something up that I look at it and say, God, that's beautiful. If I could do something like that with my materials, and a stick with some animal hair glued to it, I would be just so happy, so fulfilled as a being. And sometime in I think about the mid-90s, partly just out of frustration, and particularly working as a still life painter, and particularly working with flowers, a layer painting for a person who's trying to avoid photography is problematic. When you're trying to paint flowers over a couple of days, in one sitting, a bud opens up, and it's, and if you're not involved in photography, just painting from life it poses a lot of challenges. And so somewhere in the 90s, I began to try to teach myself alla prima. So all 6 paintings, this is alla prima, meaning a single session painting. It's done in one sitting, a single skin paint. And so a lot of us here are working in an open form way, trying to find form and color in very immediate ways. And so these are really experiments in trying to give the illusion of reality of certain forms, but trying to mask them up. And within life, I'm really experimenting with blurring some things to dissolve and get away from that line where I'm just focusing on planes that reveal form and color. So
I would say it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I'm often as surprised at how the paintings turn out as anybody else might. So I'm going to say none. It doesn't mean that I throw composition to the wind, color to the wind, something that makes a successful painting design to the wind. That's still, very important and always on my mind to make happen, although it's not something that you can say it's a fish, it's a flower, it's a shell. I think my paintings are a lot more like buildings. And the second that you change one, until you get to that very, very end point, you change one thing in the painting and something else totally needs to be adjusted. And up until that last line or that last, that brave stroke where you can go, it's done. It's, it's a very morphy thing.
Yeah.
So have any of you ever thought about trying to completely run away from any influence you've ever had? Jump off a cliff and create something nobody's ever seen.
It's an interesting question.
Can I add to that? And is that possible?
Yes.
Or is that the goal at the end?
My
Keep on
my
developing.
first thing was, that's impossible.
Right.
I'm thinking of the story of, is it of Cortez, the Spanish Cortez, or the old account, I'm not going to be able to like name specifically who it came from, but the account of Native Americans seeing ships, Spanish ships approaching and not knowing what they were because they had never seen them before. And for that reason, they weren't threatened by them because they didn't have any reason to be. So I think it's hard to imagine something you've never seen before, and therefore to do something that you've based on something you've never seen before, something visual.
It feels to me like most artists would perhaps delve into new compositions or new subject matter that sort of escape the style that they've developed and they've invested in. That they might do 4 houses in a row and then all of a sudden say, well, now it's cat. You know, it's just that you might have to change up your vocabulary, that it would cause you to have to change up your hand and the way that you're making this application and your palette, and that subject matter might change things a little bit. But I feel like there's an enormous investment in your own specifics.